The night before it all happened, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the glow of the setting sun stretch across the horizon. It was supposed to be a place of peace, my home, my family's safe haven after years of hard work. Yet behind the fences and manicured lawns, there lingered a poison that threatened to destroy everything I had built. That poison had a name: Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA. She didn't just enforce rules. She thrived on breaking people down, turning neighbors against each other, making life unbearable for anyone who dared to stand in her way. But what she didn't know was that the storm she stirred would come back to drown her. And I, of all people, would be the one holding the tide. It all began with something small, as these things often do. My daughter Emily had set up a lemonade stand at the edge of our yard, her bright smile and hand-drawn signs making my heart swell with pride. She was only 10, but she had her mother's kindness and my stubborn streak. That stand was her little dream, her way of saving money for a puppy she'd been begging for. Neighbors stopped by, praised her lemonade, dropped dollar bills into her jar, and told her she was destined for something special. Then Karen showed up. She strutted down the street with her clipboard clutched tight to her chest, lips pressed so hard they nearly disappeared. "This is a violation," she sneered, staring at Emily's stand like it was a toxic spill. "Unapproved commerce on HOA property." Against code, Emily's smile faltered. "But it's just lemonade, ma'am." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't backtalk me, little girl. Shut it down, or I'll call the police." I stepped out then, my jaw tight, fists clenched at my sides. "It's a child selling lemonade. You want to waste police time on this?" Karen's eyes flicked up at me, full of the smugness I'd grown to hate. "Rules are rules, Sheriff," she said, spitting out my title with venom. "Your badge doesn't make you above the HOA." Her words dug deep, but not for the reason she thought. It wasn't about my badge. It was about my family. Emily's face burned red with embarrassment, her eyes glistening. She packed up her stand silently, her little dream crumbling in front of her. I carried her things inside, but the damage was already done. That night, she cried herself to sleep. And as I tucked her in, her words broke me. "Daddy, why does she hate us so much?" From that day on, Karen's war against my family escalated. She issued fines for everything our grass being half an inch too long. A flower pot, she claimed, was unsightly. Even the American flag I had hanging proudly by the porch. Each notice was delivered with a smirk, each fine designed to chip away at our spirit. My wife tried to keep peace, to remind me that fighting her would only feed her hunger for control. But when Karen called the cops on my son for parking his truck in our own driveway, I knew enough was enough. The officers who came that evening were embarrassed. They knew me, respected me. Some of them had even served under me. They shook their heads at the absurdity, but said they had to respond since the call had been made. Karen stood across the street, arms crossed, a sick smile plastered on her face as if she'd already won. "See, Sheriff?" she shouted. "You may wear that badge, but in this neighborhood, I'm in charge. And if you don't like it, you can leave." Her voice rang through the air like nails scraping a chalkboard. My son clenched his fists, ready to snap, but I raised a hand to calm him. I could feel the anger building inside me, a fire hotter than I'd ever known. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was about dignity, family, and the heart of what it meant to have a home. The cops looked at me, waiting. They didn't want to be there. I could see it in their eyes. One of them, a rookie, glanced at me nervously, as if silently asking what he should do. That was when I realized Karen had made her biggest mistake yet. She had turned the law into a weapon against me, forgetting that the law was the very foundation I stood on. I took a step forward, my boots heavy on the pavement. The officer stiffened, instinctively snapping to attention. And then, In one unified motion, they saluted me. The gesture was simple, but it cracked the air like thunder. Karen's smugness drained from her face, her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide in disbelief. For the first time, she realized what she was up against. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and porch railings, murmurs rising like a storm. They saw her not as a leader, but as a petty tyrant exposed. My heart pounded, not with anger now, but with something sharper, quiet resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen thought she could wield power through fear. But what she didn't understand was that true power came from respect, from justice, from people standing together. And I would make sure she learned that lesson the hard way. That night, as I sat again on the porch with my coffee growing cold, I knew a battle line had been drawn. The HOA had become Karen's kingdom, but kingdoms fall. And when hers crumbled, it wouldn't just be me who found peace again, it would be every neighbor she had ever tormented. And I promised myself, for Emily, for my family, and for everyone who had suffered in silence, that I would be the one to deliver the justice she never saw coming. The next morning felt like walking through fog. The sun was the same, the air the same, but everything carried a different weight, like the neighborhood had been measured and found wanting. Emily padded into the kitchen, eyes puffy, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She tried to joke about school, about math homework, but the laugh broke off halfway. My wife sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug, staring into nothing. We were all holding pieces of a night that had splintered something in us. I ate in silence, tasting bitterness like metal. And the badge on my hip felt heavier than ever. I thought about confrontation, about storming HOA meetings and naming Karen in front of everyone. Part of me wanted to shout until my voice was raw, to make her hear her cruelty in a voice she couldn't ignore. But I've learned over the years that the loudest move isn't always the smartest. Just as real justice works like careful plumbing. You find the leak, you follow it, and you shut down the source so it can't come back. I was a sheriff who'd learned to think like that. I wouldn't let rage make me reckless. I'd use what I knew without becoming the thing I hated, so I started small. I walked the neighborhood with our dog, watching faces behind curtains, listening for the tiny sounds that tell you whether a community is cracking or holding. The usual nods weren't there. Instead, furtive glances and tight mouths. I stopped to chat with Mrs. Alvarez, who had been one of Karen's earliest targets. Her little rosebush had been fined because Karen said it obstructed sight lines. Nonsense that made everyone roll their eyes, except Mrs. Alvarez, who paid the fine because she didn't want to fight. She pressed my hand, voice thin. "We're tired, Sheriff. People don't want trouble." Her eyes were wet. She wasn't the only one who had been silenced. There were stories like threads running under the neighborhood. A single father fined into bankruptcy for a broken fence. A retired school teacher threatened with liens because her hedges grew wild one summer after her husband died. A young couple with a sick baby forced to cover their driveway with ugly gravel because the HOA said the pavers weren't consistent. Karen had perfected the art of making small things terrifying. She weaponized rules the way some people weaponize words: to cut, to humiliate, to control. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and began to write. Not a public denunciation, not yet. First, a paper trail. I requested copies of every violation Karen had issued in the past 3 years. I pulled HOA meeting minutes, scanned emails, collected receipts. If she wanted to fight with regulations, we would let regulations do the same to her. I reached out, quietly, to 2 officers I trusted and asked them to help gather statements. Nothing official on the record yet, just conversations. I needed to know who else had been made small by her, and I needed proof that her harassment was systematic, not accidental. The harder part was talking to my family about it. My wife, never the one to seek confrontation, would rather keep the peace than burn bridges. "Don't make this bigger than it is," she warned, concern etched across her face. "You can handle it. You always do. But are you sure you want to drag our name into a fight?" I saw her fear for our children, and it nearly convinced me to step back. But when Emily showed me a drawing she'd made at school, a big house with a little girl holding a sign that read, "Safe Home," I felt something in me break and then remake into iron. "We're already in the fight," I said softly. She started it. We began to strategize. I had to be careful. As sheriff, my duty was to uphold the law, not to use it for personal vendettas. I vowed to act within that line to make our case clean and undeniable. We started by encouraging neighbors to document everything. Posters in store windows, polite reminders on community boards, and a quiet message through the PTA. If anyone had an experience with the HOA that felt unfair, write it down. I made myself available, not as a man with a grudge, but as someone listening. The first few people were hesitant, eyes flicking to doors as they talked. But slowly, like water wearing away stone, people began to open. Each statement I read did something to my heart. Some made me sick with anger. Others made me ache with sorrow. A father who had been fined hundreds for stacking his children's bicycles in an inappropriate manner. A widow who'd been issued a notice for excessive noise. The noise being her soft sobs after losing her husband. Each story was a bead on a chain, and together they made a necklace heavy with pain. I read them into the evening, and when I closed my eyes, I saw the neighborhood not as trimmed hedges and white picket fences, but as a wounded community stitched together with secrecy. Meanwhile, Karen didn't sleep. She continued her patrols with that clipboard. But now there was something different in her posture, haughtier, almost desperate. She'd started posting more stern notices on lampposts and leaving admonishing letters for anyone who dared to disagree. She'd taken to standing in the middle of meetings like a chess player who believed herself 3 moves ahead. But chess players can be outmaneuvered. Every document I collected, every witness who agreed to speak, became a move toward checkmate. I was patient. I was deliberate. The turning moment came in the least dramatic way. A neighbor, a quiet man named Paul, who rarely spoke at meetings, brought over an envelope and asked me to read it. Inside was a stack of photographs, receipts, screenshots of emails, and a photo of Karen at a private property sale. ALLEGEDLY, accepting a small payment from a landscaping company shortly after they received a lucrative HOA contract. It looked like a coincidence until you saw the dates, the payment, the contract, the sudden fines against the people who owned competing businesses. It smelled rotten. I took the photos and felt the same cold that comes with recognizing the scale of something. Rotten and knowing you have to act. This was no longer petty tyranny. It was corruption. And corruption is a cancer that, if not cut out, kills the healthy parts around it. I called my trusted deputy and asked him to prepare a report, not public. Not yet, but enough to open a formal inquiry if the evidence held. We had to move carefully. One misstep and Karen would paint us as vindictive, and the community would close ranks. But the flicker of hope I'd felt when neighbors began to speak was now a steady flame. That night, under the glow of the kitchen light, Emily asked me if I was scared. She was 10, but she looked at me like she was trying to read the weather inside my face. I told her the truth. I was scared of failing her, of letting her see the world as a place where bullies could run unchecked. But I also told her I was hopeful because people were finally seeing the truth. She hugged my neck and whispered, "Make her stop." I promised I would. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the slow, certain unmasking of a person who thought their mask would never come off. Over the next weeks, we kept building the case quietly, filing formal complaints through the right channels, preserving receipts, and making sure every statement was signed and dated. People who had hidden for years now walked into my office and told me their stories. Some cried. Some were angry. Some just wanted to know that someone cared. I listened, and when they left, they walked a little straighter. But even as we worked in the light of paperwork and procedure, Karen noticed. Her actions became more frantic, more public. She started holding late-night meetings with anyone who'd listen, brandishing bylaws like a preacher with scripture. She'd tailgate cars, call out neighbors who parked slightly over lines. And when she saw me in my uniform, she'd smile a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a person who sensed a storm, but believed they could still move the furniture. The neighborhood was nervous now, waiting for the next move like people waiting for thunder after the first drop of rain. I had no illusions about what would happen next. There would be ugliness before there was justice. There would be pain to bear, and there might be consequences that tested us. But I had a family that needed protection, a community that needed a voice, and a responsibility to myself not to stand down. I closed files late into the night, eyes stinging. And when I finally went to bed, I dreamt of standing at a podium while the whole community watched. In that dream, my voice did not shake. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived like a storm before dawn. You could feel the pressure in the air, the kind that makes people restless before the rain comes. I put on my uniform slowly, button by button, the weight of the badge heavy against my chest. My wife watched me from the kitchen, worry etched into the lines of her face. She didn't say much, she didn't need to. Her eyes carried all the words. Be careful. Don't let them take you down with her. Protect our kids. I kissed her forehead and promised I'd be back before dinner. But we both knew this wasn't just another meeting. When I pulled into the community center, my parking lot was fuller than I had ever seen it. Trucks, sedans, minivans lined the spaces, some even parked on the grass. Neighbors who usually avoided these gatherings walked toward the building in groups, murmuring with a quiet energy, like soldiers marching toward a battlefield they hadn't chosen but could no longer ignore. The chatter fell when I walked past, not because they feared me, but because they were waiting to see if I would finally do what they hadn't been able to. Inside, the air was thick. Folding chairs filled every inch of the room. Neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder. The front table was decorated with the HOA seal, a banner draped neatly across. And there she was, Karen sitting in the middle like a queen on her throne. Clipboard in front of her, chin-high eyes sweeping the room with the sharpness of a hawk circling prey. She thrived on this, the attention, the control. Her smile tightened when she spotted me, and though she tried to mask it, I saw the flicker of unease. She knew something had shifted. Order, she snapped, pounding the gavel. This meeting will begin immediately. Anyone speaking without recognition will be fined. The crowd murmured, some rolling their eyes, others too beaten down to argue. Karen loved to start with fear. But tonight, fear had less room to breathe. She began with her usual script financial reports. Maintenance fees, a new round of rules about fence heights and acceptable paint colors. But her voice carried less power than usual. People weren't nodding, weren't pretending to care. They were waiting for the storm to break. When she called for community concerns, the silence was heavy. No one wanted to be first. That's when I stood. Sheriff, she said, narrowing her eyes, do you have a personal matter to bring before the board? I didn't speak right away. Instead, I laid a folder thick with papers on the front table. Every page was a complaint, a fine, a statement. And then I looked out at the neighbors, nodded her. For years, I began, my voice steady but low. We've all lived under the shadow of rules meant not to protect this neighborhood, but to control it. We've been fined, humiliated, threatened. Families have been broken, dreams destroyed. And it hasn't been for safety. It hasn't been for the good of this community. It's been for power, for personal gain. The room was silent but alive, every ear straining. Karen slammed her gavel again. Out of order. You have no authority here. I turned my gaze on her. No authority. Karen, I am a sworn officer of this county. And when corruption reaches into my community, into the lives of people I love, I have every authority to speak. Her face paled, but she forced a laugh. Corruption. Is that your excuse because your daughter couldn't follow the rules with her little stand? You've always thought you were above us because of your badge. But here, you're just another homeowner. And you'll play by the rules like the rest of us. The words stung because she wanted them to. She wanted to paint me as selfish, as someone using my position for revenge. But before I could speak, Mrs. Alvarez stood. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. My husband planted those roses for me before he died. She'll find me for them. I paid because I didn't want trouble. But it broke me. It broke me, Karen, and you smiled while you did it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen tried to speak, but another voice rose, Paul, holding up the photographs he had given me. She took money from contractors, then find the rest of us to cover the costs. I've got the proof right here. The room erupted, voices rising like waves crashing. People shouted, cried, demanded answers. Karen pounded her gavel again and again, but no one was listening anymore. For the first time, her control was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. I raised my hand, and the room slowly quieted. We have documented proof, testimonies, financial records. Enough for a formal investigation. Tonight, this stops. You've hidden behind bylaws and rules, but the truth doesn't need a vote. It just needs courage. Karen's face twisted, desperation breaking through her practiced smile. You think you can take me down with lies? With gossip? I'll sue every single one of you. You'll regret this. And then it happened. One by one, neighbors stood. First Mrs. Alvarez, then Paul, then a young mother with a baby on her hip, then an older man leaning on a cane. They stood, shoulders squared, voices steady. No more. The words spread like a chant, each voice adding to the weight. No more. No more. No more. Karen's face drained of color. She looked around, searching for someone to back her, but there was no one left. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably, some turning their chairs away. She was alone on her throne. I leaned in close enough for her to hear, but loud enough that the room carried my words. You called the cops last time, Karen. You thought backup would save you. But this is the real backup. A community standing together. And you can't fine an entire neighborhood into silence. The chant grew louder, filling the hall until the walls seemed to vibrate with it. Karen dropped her gavel, her hands trembling. For the first time since she'd risen to power, she had no weapon, no fear left to wield. And though the night was far from over, though the real work of investigation and justice was still ahead, in that moment something powerful shifted. The community was no longer hers to command. The leash had snapped. I stood tall, feeling the weight of every story, every tear, every injustice. And I swore silently. This was just the beginning. The days after the meeting felt like the air after a heavy storm, broken branches on the ground. Silence in the streets, but also that strange freshness, like something new was possible. Neighbors who had once hurried into their houses now stopped at mailboxes to talk. They weren't whispering anymore. They were venting. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to say Karen's name out loud without looking over their shoulder. But with that freedom came something sharper, anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see if she would truly fall, or if she'd claw her way back with the same viciousness that had kept her on her throne. Karen didn't vanish. That would have been too easy. She doubled down. The morning after the meeting, letters appeared on doorsteps across the neighborhood. harshly worded notices declaring that false accusations against the HOA were considered defamation and would result in fines and legal action. My wife found ours crumpled in the mailbox, her face tightening as she read. She's cornered, but she's not done. I sat at the table, rereading the notice. The language wasn't legal, just intimidation. She was bluffing, trying to scare people back into silence. But the difference now was that people weren't alone anymore. They had tasted unity, and you can't take that back once it's real. Still, Karen wasn't just dangerous because of her words. She had connections, board members who'd turned a blind eye, people who had quietly benefited from her grip. She could still do damage if we weren't careful. That was when I made the call. Not to the neighbors, not to the HOA board, but to the county investigator who handled fraud and misuse of funds. I didn't ask for favors. I presented the evidence cleanly, professionally, like any case I would handle if it weren't my own neighborhood. He listened without interrupting, flipping through the photos and documents, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "This is enough to open a formal inquiry." The words hit like a hammer. It was happening. The wheels of justice were turning. But justice isn't quick. It grinds slowly, methodically. And Karen, sensing the walls closing in, grew frantic. Within a week, she called a special emergency meeting. Flyers were taped to every lamppost, declaring that the HOA was under attack by disruptive forces and that she would defend the integrity of the community. I didn't want to go. My wife begged me not to, but I had to. If Karen was planning to rally her last bit of power, I needed to be there to see it. The community center was full again, but this time the energy was different. No quiet anticipation. This was anger. People waving Karen's notices in the air, demanding explanations, shouting over each other. Karen sat at the table, her smile tight, makeup heavy, as if to mask the cracks. She banged the gavel, but it didn't silence the crowd. Finally, she stood, raising her voice above the chaos. "All of you are blind. You think she jabbed a finger toward me is your savior? He's using you. He wants to dismantle everything we've built, turn this neighborhood into chaos. He doesn't care about you. He only cares about power. Look at him. Sheriff or not, he is nothing here. Nothing." The words stung, not because they were true, but because I could see fear flickering in some neighbors' eyes. Doubt is a dangerous seed. If she could plant it, she could regrow her throne. I stood, not raising my voice, but speaking low and steady so the room leaned in to hear. Power isn't measured by how many fines you can hand out. Power is when people trust you. Power is when families feel safe in their homes. You've ruled with fear, Karen, and you're right about one thing: this isn't about me. It's about all of them. I turned to the crowd. If she's ever fined you unfairly, stand up. Chairs scraped. One by one, people rose. Mrs. Alvarez, Paul, the young mother with the baby. Then more, dozens. Almost the entire room stood. The only ones who didn't were the board members sitting beside Karen, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of all those eyes. Karen's face drained of color. Her hand trembled on the gavel. "Sit down," she screamed, voice cracking. "Sit down or you're all in violation." But no one sat then. Something happened I'll never forget. My son, who had stayed quiet through all of this, stood in the back of the room. He had his truck keys in hand, his voice strong. "She called the cops on me for parking in my own driveway. Treated me like a criminal in front of my family. That ends tonight." The room erupted in applause and shouts. Karen slammed her gavel again and again, but it was useless. Her power was gone, stripped away not by me, but by the people she had broken for years. They weren't scared anymore. I walked to the front, standing beside her table. She wouldn't look at me. Her jaw was clenched, her hands white-knuckled around the gavel. I leaned close enough that only she could hear. You thought you could break this community with fear? But fear doesn't last. Respect does. And you never had it. Her shoulders sagged. For the first time, she looked small. Not a queen, not a tyrant. Just a bitter woman clinging to power that no longer existed. When I turned back to the crowd, people were chanting again. No more. No more. No more. The sound shook the walls. Karen dropped the gavel. She left the room without another word, her heels clicking against the floor. The door slamming behind her. But even as cheers filled the hall, I knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't finished. People like Karen never go quietly. And somewhere deep down, I knew she was already planning her next move. The night Karen stormed out of that meeting, the whole neighborhood celebrated like they'd won a war. People lingered in the parking lot, clapping each other on the backs, some even hugging. My son was surrounded by neighbors who finally saw him not as a kid in a pickup truck, but as a young man who stood tall against a bully. Emily clung to my hand the whole way home, whispering, "Daddy, she's gone, right?" I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to promise her the nightmare was over. But deep down, I knew better. Karen was the kind of person who could lose a battle and still convince herself the war wasn't done. For a few days, life felt lighter. The notices stopped showing up in mailboxes. Kids played basketball in driveways without worried glances over their shoulders. Even the lawns looked brighter, freed from the shadow of her endless scrutiny. My wife started planting flowers again, her hands in the soil like she was claiming back the peace Karen had tried to take. But I never let my guard down. When someone like Karen disappears, it isn't retreat, it's plotting. I was proven right one quiet Wednesday evening. I was just finishing up dinner when the flashing blue and red lights filled our windows. My heart dropped. 2 patrol cars pulled into our driveway, doors opening in unison. My deputies, men I knew, men I trusted, stepped out with uneasy looks on their faces. Behind them, standing tall and smug in the glow of their headlights, was Karen. She had her arms crossed, her chin tilted up, like a general arriving at a conquered field. "Sheriff," one of the officers said reluctantly, "we received multiple calls tonight from your HOA president." He glanced at Karen, then back at me. "She claims there's illegal activity happening on your property. Noise complaints, unregistered vehicles, even livestock violations." His tone was apologetic, almost embarrassed. Karen smirked. "The law is the law, even for you, Sheriff. If you think your badge protects you, think again." My wife gasped. Emily clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter. My son clenched his fists, ready to explode, but I raised a hand to stop him. This was Karen's move to bait us, to push us into anger so she could twist the story. "Boys," I said calmly to the officers, "you've known me long enough to know the truth. There's no illegal activity here. No noise, no livestock, no violations. What you're looking at," I gestured toward, "Karen, is harassment. You don't need a warrant to see that." The officers exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Sheriff, we're required to make a report. We'll need to at least document the complaint." Karen's smile widened. "Document it? And if you don't act, I'll take this higher." Nobody is above the HOA, not even him. The air was thick, tense, the kind of moment where one wrong word could unravel everything. Then something remarkable happened. The younger deputy straightened his back, looked Karen square in the eye, and said, "Ma'am, all due respect, I've lived in this county my whole life. I know when someone's abusing the system. This isn't law enforcement. This is a personal vendetta." Karen's mouth fell open. "How dare you?" But before she could finish, the senior deputy added, "Sheriff's record is clean. His family's clean. If you keep misusing emergency services like this, you're the one we'll have to cite. False reports are a crime, ma'am." The words hit her like a slap. Her smugness faltered, eyes darting as if searching for backup that wasn't coming. She had expected them to side with her, to humiliate me in front of my family. Instead, she stood alone under flashing lights, her plan crumbling in real time. I stepped closer, not to threaten, but to make my point clear. "You called the cops for backup, Karen. You thought flashing lights would scare us? But look around. The only one being warned tonight is you." The deputies turned off their lights, filed their reports with minimal notes, and left. Karen stood in the driveway a moment longer, trembling with rage. Before storming off into the night, inside, my wife sank into a chair, her face pale. "How much longer do we have to live like this?" she whispered. I knelt beside her, took her hand. "Not much longer. The investigation is moving. She's running out of moves. She knows it. That's why she's desperate." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that desperation could make her more dangerous than ever. She had lost her grip on the neighborhood, lost her credibility, and now, little by little, was losing her mind. 2 days later, the county investigator called. His voice was calm, but the words carried weight. "We've got enough. Fraud, misuse of funds, harassment. It's strong. We'll need you at the hearing when we present it to the board and legal counsel." For the first time in weeks, relief washed over me. We weren't just fighting shadows anymore. There would be a reckoning, one that Karen couldn't escape with smirks or gavel slams. That night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she asked softly, "Daddy, will she ever stop?" I stroked her hair and said, "Yes, sweetheart." Because sometimes, even the loudest bullies have to answer to something bigger than themselves. Still. As I walked out of her room and looked into the dark yard, I felt the tension before the final storm. Karen wasn't done fighting. And before justice landed, she'd make one last desperate play. The courtroom was colder than it should have been. Or maybe it was just the way the HOA board sat there, arms crossed. Smug smiles spread across their faces like they'd already won. Karen had her lips curled in that satisfied smirk she always wore when she thought she was in control. The county courtroom wasn't big wooden benches lined the sides. Old ceiling fans turned lazily, and the faint smell of polished oak lingered in the air. Families from the neighborhood had gathered, some whispering, some avoiding eye contact with me. They knew the fight had grown far beyond just a simple HOA rule. This was about power, respect, and whether one woman could bully an entire community into silence. I sat there, jaw tight, my hands clasped so hard together that my knuckles had gone white. On my left sat my wife, her presence steadying me like an anchor in a storm. On my right, my son leaned forward, glaring at the board with youthful fire. He wanted revenge, but I wanted something greater justice. The kind that lasted, the kind that showed Karen her empire was built on lies and intimidation. The judge walked in. Gray hair, stern face. The type of man who had seen his share of small-town disputes, but carried the weight of fairness in every word. He gave us all a glance that told me he wouldn't be swayed by theatrics. Karen didn't seem to notice. She was already preparing her speech, papers stacked high in front of her. She began with venom, dressed as politeness. "Your Honor, this homeowner has been in direct violation of HOA bylaws repeatedly. He's harassed board members, resisted fines, and endangered our community's harmony. Last week, he threatened to bring law enforcement into our neighborhood matters, which is not only inappropriate, but dangerous." She lifted her chin, looking straight at me with those cold, victorious eyes. I clenched my jaw, but didn't speak. My lawyer and old friend from my days serving the county. Someone who owed me more than a favor stood and let Karen finish digging her hole. When she was done, He calmly stepped forward. His voice steady, smooth, every word slicing through her accusations like a blade. Your Honor, the HOA board has overstepped its authority. What they call violations are fabricated. What they call harmony is control. And what they call dangerous is a sheriff doing his sworn duty to protect his community. He turned slightly, hand motioning toward me. This man is the elected sheriff of this county. The law doesn't stop at the gate of a subdivision. And when Ms. Karen here called the cops to handle her personal vendettas, she forgot one thing she called his deputies. The room erupted in murmurs. Karen's face drained of color. She hadn't expected that reveal to land so hard. Families who had stayed silent for months leaned closer, whispering to one another. A few even smiled, small but meaningful. Like hope was finally cracking through the board's shadow. Karen tried to recover, her voice shrill now. That doesn't matter. He's still subject to our rules. His position doesn't exempt him from what? My lawyer cut her off. From your harassment, from your threats, from your misuse of authority. He pulled out a stack of photocopies of notices Karen had taped to my door. Fines for things like leaving a flag up too long or my son's truck parked at the edge of the driveway. Petty, ridiculous rules that no one else was fined for. He laid them on the judge's bench like evidence in a trial of character. The judge's brow furrowed. These are excessive. He looked over at Karen, and I caught the first flicker of doubt in her eyes. The power she wielded so easily in the neighborhood didn't carry here. Here, she was just another person, and her arrogance was catching up with her. But the real turning point came when the witnesses were called. One by one, neighbors who had been too afraid before stood up and spoke. Mrs. Harris, the widow who Karen once threatened with foreclosure over a cracked fence. The Martinez family, fined for their kids' bicycles being left outside for a single night. Even old Mr. Thompson, who could barely walk without his cane, stood up trembling but determined. She told me if I didn't replace my mailbox, she'd have me evicted, he said, his voice shaking but firm. I've lived here longer than she's been alive. Karen's composure cracked piece by piece, like glass splintering under pressure. She stammered, tried to defend herself, but the more she spoke, the more she revealed just how little she cared for fairness, how much she cared for control. By the time my lawyer called me to the stand, the room was silent, waiting. I rose slowly, my boots heavy against the wooden floor. I didn't shout, didn't accuse. I just told the truth. About the harassment, the constant fines, the threats. About the night she called the cops, hoping to humiliate me, only to find herself standing face to face with the sheriff she had been trying to tear down. And finally, I ended with the words that had been burning in my chest since this war began. Your Honor, I don't stand here just as a homeowner. I stand here as the sheriff of this county. My oath is to protect the people, all people including those who live in this neighborhood. I won't let a single individual, no matter how loud or entitled, turn our community into a place of fear. Not while I wear this badge. The silence that followed was deep, powerful, and heavy. Even the judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. I've heard enough. Judgment will be given tomorrow. Karen stood frozen, eyes wide, lips trembling like she couldn't believe what had just happened. For the first time, she looked small, powerless, and I knew whatever came tomorrow. Her reign of fear was ending. The morning of the judgment. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the whole county held its breath. The courthouse steps were crowded with neighbors. Reporters from the local station, even deputies in uniform who had quietly come to show support. My wife walked beside me, her hand slipping into mine, warm and steady. My son followed close, his jaw set, the fire in his eyes brighter than ever. For months we had been living under the shadow of Karen and her HOA board. and today felt like the sunrise after the longest storm dawned inside. The courtroom buzzed with nervous whispers. Karen sat at her table, pale and stiff, her hair done to perfection, but her confidence unraveling with every glance she stole toward the bench. The other HOA board members sat behind her, avoiding her eyes as if they already knew the tide had turned. They looked less like allies and more like prisoners waiting for their sentence. The judge entered. Robes swaying, and the room hushed. His expression was stern, his eyes sharp as he placed his papers down with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority, filling every corner of the room. I have reviewed the testimonies, the evidence, and the pattern of behavior presented in this case. It is clear to this court that the HOA board, under Ms. Karen's leadership, has grossly abused its authority. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's mouth fell open slightly, her painted lips twitching as if she wanted to argue but couldn't form the words. The judge continued. Harassment disguised as enforcement, fines issued without due process. Intimidation against homeowners. These actions do not reflect community service, but tyranny. This board has forgotten its duty and acted as if it were above the law. That ends today. He paused, his gavel tapping once against the wood. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Effective immediately, the current HOA leadership is dissolved. New elections will be held, supervised by the county. Furthermore, restitution will be paid to the homeowners unjustly fined. And lastly, this court refers Ms. Karen's conduct for criminal review misuse of authority and harassment. The room erupted. Some gasped, others cheered softly, and more than a few broke into relieved applause. My son grinned wide. My wife's eyes welled with tears she quickly brushed away. And I just sat there, heart pounding in my chest. The words sinking in like the sweetest justice I'd ever heard. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is outrageous. You can't just strip me of power. I built this neighborhood. I kept it in order. I, the judge, banged the gavel sharply. Enough, Ms. Karen. You've built nothing but fear. Sit down or I will have you removed. She sat, trembling, her face red with fury and humiliation. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like a queen now looked like a fallen tyrant, stripped of her throne. After the session ended, people gathered around us in the hallway. Mrs. Harris clasped my wife's hands, her voice breaking as she thanked her for standing strong. The Martinez kids hugged my son, calling him their hero. Even old Mr. Thompson, leaning heavily on his cane, saluted me with tears in his eyes. And then, as we stepped out into the sunlight, something unexpected happened. My deputies, who had lined the courthouse steps quietly, stood tall and snapped into formation. At once, they raised their hands in a crisp salute, not to me as sheriff, but to me as a man who had fought for his family and community. The entire crowd hushed. Karen, walking out flanked by two officers ready to question her further, froze in her tracks. Her eyes darted to the deputies, then to me. She had called the cops once to humiliate me, to try to break me. Now here they were, saluting me in front of her, honoring not just my badge, but my fight. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her face paled, and for the first time she was truly speechless. I lifted my hand, returning the salute with slow, deliberate pride. Around us, the crowd broke into cheers, the sound echoing across the courthouse square. My son grinned so wide I thought his cheeks might split. My wife clutched my arm, and for the first time in a long time, peace settled heavy and warm in my chest. Justice wasn't just a ruling in court, it was the moment a community found its voice again. When families no longer lived under fear, when a bully was stripped of her crown. Karen's empire had crumbled, and the sheriff's salute had left her with nothing but silence. And in that silence we finally found freedom.